The Little Button Elves. 1 button, 2 button, 3 button, 4 button, and 5 button were 5 little elves who were so alike that no one could tell which one was which. Because of this, one of them wore only 1 button on his tunic, the next had 2 buttons, and so on, and everyone called them by the number of their buttons. "Here comes 1 button," the pixie folk used to cry as they saw the elf with 1 button coming down the road. "2 button is out shopping," they said, when they saw the elf with 2 buttons going out with a basket. It was quite easy to tell which was which by counting the buttons. Now one day, all 5 elves went out together to picnic on Bumblebee Common. 1 button carried the kettle, 2 button carried the bread and butter, 3 button carried the cakes, 4 button carried the apples, and 5 button carried the cups and plates. Just as they were crossing over the little bridge that leads to the common, 3 button stumbled and fell. He only just managed not to fall into the water beneath, but alas, the cakes did. How upset all the button elves were. It was dreadful to have no cakes at a picnic tea. 3 button was very sorry about it, but it couldn't be helped. They found a nice place to have their picnic, and then 3 buttons said that, as he had lost all the cakes, he would take the job of going to ask for water for their kettle. So off he started. He saw a cottage in the distance and walked towards it. As he drew near to it, he smelt a delicious smell of newly made cakes. He knocked on the door and an old dame opened it. 3 button thought she looked very like a witch, but she had kind eyes, so he felt sure she wouldn't be. "Please may I have some water for my kettle?" he asked. "Certainly," said the old dame. "Step into my kitchen and take some from the tap." So 3 button walked into the kitchen and filled his kettle. Then suddenly he caught sight of the table, and his eyes and mouth opened in surprise, for it was piled high with hundreds of cakes, all newly made and smelling simply delicious. 3 button remembered how he dropped the picnic cakes into the water, and a very naughty thought came into his head. Surely the old dame would never miss 5 cakes from such a big pile. In a trice, the naughty little elf snatched 5 buns from the table, took up his kettle and ran out the door. He raced back to the others and showed them what he'd got, but he didn't tell them that he'd stolen the buns. They were very pleased. Soon the kettle was boiling away merrily, and 1 button made the tea. Then the elves set to work on the bread and butter. When they'd finished that, they started on the newly baked cakes, and they were simply delicious. But just as they were handing one another the apples, a curious thing happened. Each elf began to feel very uncomfortable. They looked at one another and then cried out in dismay. "We're all getting very fat," they cried, and pointed to each other. Sure enough they were. Their little tunics became very tight, and their toes burst out of their boots. Soon their hats were much too small and fell off their heads. "What is it?" cried 1 button. "What can be the matter with us?" But none of them knew. It was really dreadful. They grew bigger and bigger, and at last, with a pop, 1 button's little button flew off his tunic. Then 2 buttons flew off too, and 3 buttons and 4 buttons. 5 buttons popped off as well, and soon the grass was strewn with all their buttons. Crying bitterly, they ran home. Everyone they met stared at them in astonishment. When they got home, they shut themselves up and looked all through their magic books to find out what was the matter with them. And very soon they discovered that pimpernel cakes eaten newly made caused people to grow terribly fat all in a hurry. Then 3 button began to sob, and he confessed to the others that he'd stolen the 5 cakes that he'd brought to them. "I expect they must have been pimpernel cakes," he wept. "I remember seeing a lot of pimpernels growing round the old woman's cottage. What are we to do?" "Wait a minute," cried 1 button eagerly. "Here's a page that tells us what to do to get back to our own size again. Listen, melt salt and sugar together in a silver thimble and drink it in front of a fire. Then you will grow thin once more." It wasn't long before all the elves were solemnly drinking salt and sugar from silver thimbles in front of their kitchen fire. No sooner had they finished, they suddenly shrank back to their ordinary size. How glad they were! They took hands and danced around and round in glee. Just then, a pixie friend of theirs came in to see them. "Oh," he said, I just wanted to know if Two Button would, but dear me, which of you is Two Button? You haven't any buttons on at all, and you're all so alike, and I can't possibly tell which is which. The Button Elves looked at each other. Of course, the buttons had all popped off their tunics when they'd grown so fat, and now no one would know which was which. And to make things much worse, the elves themselves couldn't remember who had one button, who had 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now what are we to do? Cried the elves in despair. Who can tell us who is who? All of the little folk of the town came to try and help them, but really the elves were so much alike that it wasn't a bit of use. There's only one person who could help you, and that is Dame Pimpernel up on Bumblebee Common, said a pixie. She's a very clever person indeed. But that must be the old woman whose cake we took, said one of the Button Elves. Well, we'd better go and confess, and perhaps she'll help us. So off they all went, and soon arrived at Dame Pimpernel's house. She was very much surprised to see them, and even more astonished when she heard they'd stolen 5 of her cakes and had grown so fat. When she heard that all their buttons had popped off, she laughed till the tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks. Please don't laugh at us, begged the elves. We've managed to get thin again, but you see, we don't know which of us is which now, and people say that you are clever and can tell us. I can tell you easily enough, said old Dame Pimpernel, but you must do something for me in return. You have certainly been punished for the naughtiness of one of you, but I think you should be punished a little more. The next time you will all remember not to touch things belonging to other people. What shall we do for you then? Asked the Button Elves humbly. You can come and feed my chickens for me every day, said the old woman. I really haven't time. Very well, we'll take it in turns to come every day, promised the elves. Now please tell us which is which. Well, one button's button is gone, but his one buttonhole is not, said the dame with a laugh, and she hooked her finger into one button's one buttonhole. You are one button, 2 button is the one with 2 buttonholes, of course, and 3 button is the one with 3. 4 button and 5 button can easily find themselves by counting their buttonholes too. What a lot of little sillies you are. You could easily have thought of that for yourselves. Then the Button Elves began to laugh. They went, what sillies we are. Thank you, Dame Pimpernel. Now we will go home and sew on our buttons again. Tomorrow, one button will come and feed your chickens for you. Off they ran and got out their needles and thread. They sewed on their buttons and then felt very happy, for once again they knew which of them was which. Each day they take it in turns to feed Dame Pimpernel's chickens. On baking day they smell the newly made cakes and see them on the kitchen table, but you may be sure that not one of the Button Elves ever goes near them.